Most unlikely of villains, just modes of brain and more pause. Does it talk? Does it know how? Does it bottle? Does it meow? Let on the cerebral bore. Have I shown him so much more? Release your brains at the
Hey everybody, Jason here. Just want to say that this was recorded late at night and the podcast does start off a little bit low energy, but it does pick up and there are some really neat conversations here, so I hope you hang with it. So, with that said, let's return to our recording already in progress. Welcome back, everybody. We're happy to bring you to another wonderful panel discussion. Today on the panel, we have Carl Rodriguez of the GMologist Presents podcast, BJ Boyd of the Arcane Alienist, Joe Richter of Hindsightless, previously the GM of Wheel and Woe, the first Pathfinder 2 actual play podcast, and myself, Jason of Nerds RPG Varietycast. How are you guys doing tonight?
We're doing great.
Yeah, man.
Doing good.
It's Wheel or Woe.
Oh, okay. There we go. So Wheel or Woe. There'll be links in the show notes. Go listen to that. There's just a few hours that you need to listen to. When you go watch the Critical Role cartoon, then then you can go listen to Wheel or Woe to find out how it's supposed to be done.
Yeah, and compare and contrast.
Exactly.
That's
who took from who?
That's
Who was
based on
first?
Wheel or Woe is based on the augury spell, right?
Yes, the name of it comes from the augury spell, correct?
Which is pretty fitting for today's topic, I think.
Yes.
It is.
Very nice.
It is. So BJ, why don't you let folks know what we're going to talk about today?
So today we're going to talk about gods and pantheons in D&D and fantasy role playing, and some of the just kind of the nature of using them in your campaign, how they might fit into the campaign setting, how players might interact with the gods, how players might ascend to godhood or to higher level of existence. And that's I guess that's the general topic here. I don't think did I miss anything?
No, we're just going to talk about the different aspects of it and how it's handled in game, and maybe some good ways we've come across doing it, maybe some advice for folks, and maybe some bad ways we've seen it handled as well. Right.
Cool.
So I guess the first thing we kind of talked about is how we feel that they're best used in games. So we see some games where they're not really touched, and primarily we're going to be talking about fantasy games here, your D&D style games. But so in D&D style games, it's kind of implied you're going to have, some kind of pantheon out there, some kind of guide, some kind of higher power, because something's given the clerics the ability to cast divine magic, need the healing magic. It depends on the world you're running. If you're running a game without clerics, and that may not be the case, but normally there's, in your standard high fantasy game, that's there. But some games we'll see that it's kind of hand waved, where it's just generic good gods, bad gods, and they're not really defined at all. And some players like that, but that's not very interesting from a world building point of view, or from a player's point of view. If that player, and not just clerics, but other players that follow different deities may want to work that into their character, and so they can work into the role playing and work into what their characters are doing, both in downtime and even in the speech patterns of the characters or anything else, if the player decides to talk first person. So
if I remember correctly, Gary Gygax, originally the clerics just served the gods, and you either served the gods of law or the gods of chaos, and the players were the ones that twisted his arm into giving them specific deities and that they could choose from. And that's where he came up with Saint Cuthbert, the god of common sense, who liked to whack people upside the head with a stick when they did something stupid.
Yeah. And they moved pretty quickly on to having books. I mean, first edition had deities and demigods, right?
Yeah.
Where they tapped into your real world religions, and to the point where your Celtic gods, all the priests had to be druids and they had to do human sacrifice, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I like having an active pantheon. I like my gods to be present in the world. They're they're great quest givers, right? Like they're the ultimate quest givers. They could just show up wherever. I had one stab a character through the chest with a big great sword when she wanted to talk to him. That was dope. But yeah, I like to have them pretty active in the world, and the people know about them. The churches often are like factions and stuff. So I typically in my games have a lot of play between the different deities and churches and everything. What about you guys? Do you guys have active pantheons, or are they like, more mellow?
Well, for me, I think I have done BX type games where it's sort of chaos versus law, and you have just a generic cleric or shaman or whatever. But I think I mean, like most of my gaming has been done in a world where there is an active pantheon, where where maybe it's not directly the god, but servants of the god, those who worship the god are the quest givers, become patrons of a particular adventure or adventuring group. The cleric can go to the temple and has relationships there, and then they can get missions from the temple for the rest of the party, things like that. And then, I mean, so for me, I actually, when I was running AD&D first edition and then into second edition, I played a lot in the Forgotten Realms. Take it or leave it. It was what was available. It was cool. It was, from the small pantheon that Greyhawk had, that originated from Law versus Chaos. It was now this huge pantheon of different gods, right? So those gods then, in the transition from first to second, they actually were walking on the planet, right? So you had direct interaction, and I definitely had a series where the patron deity of one of the players met one of the players, So I like that. I think it's cool. It's really great for story building, and it's definitely memorable.
I've kind of gone back and forth depending on the campaign. I've been run a lot in Forgotten Realms, but usually in Forgotten Realms, I'm running a pre-made adventure path. And if the path does not call for one of the gods to show up, the god doesn't show up during that campaign, but that doesn't mean they don't in the Forgotten Realms. The times I've built homebrew, I've done everything from a kind of a homebrewed pantheon to what I'm doing now, where the gods are distant and mysterious, and they're kind of, because of sort of the past events, their whole time is spent just making sure the world doesn't descend into chaos. But they have these saints, and so the clerics actually interact with their patron saints, which are sort of somewhere between and so the ethos of a cleric will depend on their patron saint. I did that primarily so a cleric could work with me to just make their own patron saint.
Yeah.
So we've got an expanding list of patron saints, which are stand-ins for gods that have their own directives and ethos and things that a cleric of that saint's supposed to do. And you can pick from one of those, either one I made or one another character made, or you can make a new one. And we just say, they're unlimited, because there's all kinds of heroic people ascending to sainthood across time.
Yeah.
That was a little easier than saying, okay, who's the god of war? Who's the god of agriculture? Who's the god of this? I've done that before. I used a random name generator and just rolled up like 6 or 7 major deities and put those out there. But I find the players don't really care as long as they've got they've got a name and a kind of a general theme to kind of,
and almost a mechanic that you can hitch onto, right? If you remember, second edition had specialty priests, right?
Yeah, and then the different sphere, they would have different, I guess now we would call them domains in modern, but
now,
that started in second edition with the spheres of influence.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. So it's normally I don't run these kind of games. Normally I run sword and sorcery, or I'm running modern games or different games. So it's been a long time. I'm running an AD&D play by post right now, but so in that game, actually I open it up and they can pick whatever they want to add deities and demigods. So it's with, any of the pantheons in there, and the way that's working is, and with play by post, it's easier to do some of this stuff and actually in the modern world, it's easier to do this than it was. But and Joe's done this in his Pathfinder game, where I'm able to have deities communicate to their clerics or their followers through dreams and things like that. And you can send the message to the player showing the dream. Joe did that in our Pathfinder game where we showed up one session and the dream was there and we could share it with other people or not. It was up to us. But when we joined the game, the dream was sitting there waiting on us that we had this dream, and so I've been doing that. But I like, my preference is to pick one Pantheon and use that as opposed to having the smorgasbord of, we have Greek gods and Norse gods and Egyptian gods or Forgotten Realms gods and all that. I'm doing that in the game I'm running now, but generally I like to pick one Pantheon and just stick to that. How about you guys? What's your thoughts on that? Now, one thing I guess I should clarify there. I like the idea of having one. So really, you only ever have one god of war, one god of the ocean, whatever. But different societies throughout the world might worship different aspects of that god, and they might call them different names. But ultimately, they're still worshiping that single god, right? But that's kind of how I do it. But how do you guys deal with the idea of one Pantheon versus many?
That's typically what I do as well. Like I'll just go with the one Pantheon, but I do go the route of who's the god of war, who's the god of air, who's the goddess of fire, all that stuff. And so I'll give them names. And my naming convention for gods for the past, I don't know, almost decade now, I'll just look up meanings of words that relate to whatever they're the god of in Hebrew. On the internet, just Google, translation for storm in Hebrew and find the word. And it's oftentimes spelled out phonetically. And they're really awesome sounding words that just sound super majestic. And then I'll give them a few of those. So yeah, I do the single Pantheon, multiple name things.
Cool. BJ?
I think when you have a half a dozen different Pantheons, this is kind of where one of the things I don't like about kind of the standard AD&D approach is even if you just take one set of Pantheons, you've got the dwarf gods and the elf gods and the orc gods, and they each have their own little Pantheons. And I think when you have multiple Pantheons, you're sort of implying either a physical size of the campaign setting or a conceptual size of the campaign setting. It can kind of get hard to manage because if there's that many gods, how do they exist together? How do they, versus if you say, I've got a small Pantheon and the god may be known by a different name in a different part of the world, it just makes it a little easier to manage for me. So I tend to want one Pantheon if I'm going to have strongly defined gods, and that's, again, kind of different from what I'm doing right now, and they have kind of a moniker and several names they go by, but they have a kind of a common theme or a common purpose. But I know one thing that's kind of changed my way of thinking a little bit. I don't know if you guys have ever watched Jackson Crawford's YouTube channel. He's a professor of Norse language. He Dr. Cowboy, he lives in Colorado, and he's like always films his things. But he's commented several times throughout his video series that that the Norse didn't have a god of the sea; they had gods of the sea. So we want to think of Tyr as the god of war. Well, he's not the god of war; he's a god of war. And when we think we want to think of Nord as a god of the sea, but he's not the god of the sea like Poseidon. We sort of impose, because we actually know so little about Norse religion. We sort of interpret it through the eyes of what we understood about Greek and Roman pagan religions, and so they don't necessarily have that hierarchy of, well, this is the god of the sea and here's a lesser sea. It's a little more nebulous. So that's kind of got me rethinking, but I don't think that works well in D&D, because you kind of want, this is the god of this, and these will be the kind of spells they grant and abilities they grant their followers, and your cleric players can pick one. So from a DM standpoint, I think I kind of prefer the
one
path
thing
of least resistance there.
Yeah. Well, one thing I'd recommend before we kick to Carl, I'll put a link to this in the show notes, but anybody listens to Monster Man, James Holloway's podcast, he put out a Kickstarter last year called the Pamphlet of Pantheons, and it's available now on itch. And I will link to it on itch. It's $4.25 US. But it's really cool. It's about creating your own Pantheon. And on his podcast, he goes through and talks about all the different pantheons and deities and demigods and real world pantheons, and the idea of how, when we come up with our fantasy one, typically in a real world pantheon, you're not just like one. It's not like the guy look at Poseidon. He's the guy of the ocean, but he's also got horses, right? And he has some weird things going on there. And this pamphlet Pantheons lets you create a pantheon, but it kind of matches real world, or looks more like real world, because they're like oddball things thrown in there and things like that. So I'll link that in there. It's actually pretty cool. I backed it when he did the Kickstarter, but you could buy it now just off itch. But I want to throw it to Carl and let him weigh in on this.
Yeah, what I don't like really is like these small pantheons, kind of like what Greyhawk has, one single pantheon. And yes, like BJ said, you have dwarves, elves, orcs, whatever, but it's just like one pantheon. I remember there was this world setting called Kalimdor that had like 3, maybe 4 deities per alignment of the 9. So that's it that they had, and this was worldwide. But I don't know. I kind of like the idea of regional gods. And while the Forgotten Realms, it sounds like there are a lot of gods, it is kind of regional. If you add in like Karator and Al-Qadim and other regions, their gods are regional. But I think but coupled with that, I think something that Jason brought up is that I love the idea of aspects. So I think for me, like right now, I think Midgard, which is from Cobalt Press, they do deities in a really cool way, in that they have like regional gods or gods. Their names sound regional, but there is a Hecate, for example, in the Mediterranean analog, but a Hel in the Norse analog, and they're the same being, but their aspects are called differently. And I think that's really cool because it kind of gives like a regional feel, but then there is one pantheon in a way. And I think we learned so much as from when D&D first started, and like what BJ brought up, the more we learn, say, about Norse mythos, even Greek to Roman, we have a lot of influence from Roman, but the Greeks worship these deities very differently than the Romans did. We learn, daily, as more archaeology comes to light. And, they treated these as like powerful mythological beings that weren't stuck, in a certain domain, right? As we gamify it, they did, Zeus wasn't just, he did a lot of things, right? A lot of bad things maybe, but they treated him as like a powerful, they're in a way as an allegory for, almost an exaggeration. Some would say, like a satire of extreme human behavior, right?
Right.
Maybe, so it's pretty interesting that I think it is more interesting. And I think if I were to start a campaign and do my own homebrew, then I would kind of try to take that kind of approach, is make gods more nebulous and not try to pigeonhole them, really.
Nice.
I think that'd be a neater approach.
I did briefly, I'm trying to remember how I set this up, in one short campaign I ran, where the idea was the priests serve the gods. There's a pantheon, but there's a certain pantheon of gods that represent civilization and the people of the setting up to that point, and that you've got one cast of priests or one set of priests that just serve all. So when a generic cleric gives you a healing spell, he's praying to the god of healing, but when he hits somebody up the head with a mace, he's the god of war is guiding him.
Right. And
then there would be, which is I think a little more like the Greek and Romans, was then there are mystery cults. They're devoted to a specific god, but you don't, it's got its own secret language and terminology and rituals and things like that, and they kind of work more specifically for that god, but they get recruited out of the class of a more kind of generic clerics or priests. So that's an option you can get at some point, is to join a mystery cult, and your spell selection and your powers change a little bit. Once you kind of reach a certain level, you have to make that decision.
Right. Well, that brings up the idea too, and I guess there's a question how real, or how much we want to base on real world, not just the actual deities. Do we want Zeus or whatever? But the way real world religion works compared to the way it works in fantasy literature, right? Because they are different when you think about it. Your fantasy and I don't really want to get too in depth in real world religions, but your quote unquote when we look at it's our stories, when we look at books and cinema, movies, and all this, and the Catholic Church, you have your Catholic Church, and then you have your secret arm, the Catholic Church, that has teams of vampire slayers are running around out there and things like that, right? Which obviously, you don't have in the real world. But so do we want to base it? How realistic do we want our compared to meeting the fantasy, meeting the genre tropes? But this might lead us into, actually very well, I think Carl led us into this maybe kind of into our second topic, which is playing the priests of these deities in our games, and how we'd like to see how we play priests when we're playing them, or other characters of faith. They don't have to be a priest; it could be a paladin. It could just be a devout character. But how we play, or how we like to see our players play, characters of faith in games. If that topic kind of makes sense, as I
think our modern sensibilities make it really hard to dive into that. I mean, when I guess I do a lot of study on Roman culture and Roman stuff for gaming, not for any scholarly pursuit, but the faith was such a huge part of a Roman's daily life. Shrine to your ancestors, go to the temple of Jupiter and give an offering. You go, if you want to have good crops, go to the temple of Juno for another offering. So it's very much involved in a part of daily life. And I mean, I think I definitely rarely see that, or rarely do we push that in a fantasy game. I don't know if it's necessary. Maybe we've grown beyond that in the secular world, but it really would be, even if the players don't do it, maybe the world around them does. To show how much faith and the gods are a part of, especially right. So that's the crazy thing, is like, we don't think magic ever happened in our world, right? But magic and miracles happen every day in these people's worlds.
Right.
So, right? It's not a question of so much of faith, but this really happens, right? We give to the temple and we really get a blessing.
I think that's probably the breakdown. If you don't reinforce through some kind of game mechanic or in-game reward people role playing as though they live in a world where the gods are real, then pretty much the clerics are going to be the ones who do it, because they got to get their spells and obey certain restrictions. If you give a gold piece at this shrine, and for the rest of the day you get a luck point or something that it represents that this is real and you can interact with it.
Yeah, and it's even trickier in the fantasy world, right? Because there's the magic that comes from the gods, but then there's also this other magic that doesn't come from the gods but can do godly stuff. So like that counterbalance is it's pretty crazy to try and like put yourself in that world where you can become as powerful as a god almost. And that's just that would be one hell of a world to live in. That's for sure.
And one thing that we've talked about is on our various podcasts in the past, and I'm throw this back, Carl, here in a second. One thing we've talked about in our podcasts in the past are doing festivals and doing celebrations and holy days and making that a regular part. When you look back, and Carl can talk to this, but the calendar for your holy days was a lot fuller. It still is very full when you actually look at like your Orthodox Christianity and Roman Catholic, but they had a lot more festivals than we have as modern society. Right. And you'd have things going on all the time. And if you have that going on in your campaign, it can kind of reinforce that, with this, or having your NPCs invoke the various deities. Oh, thank Jupiter you're here, or this, and just kind of constantly peppering that in there can help. But I'm going to throw it to Carl. I didn't mean to cut him off.
Oh no, you weren't cutting me off. I want others to chime in. I love what Joe says, and that's something kind of neat. You're right. You have this sort of miracles versus magic, right? In a lot of games. But what's interesting is kind of there are some games that kind of suggest, though, that magic power comes from deity-like entities, right? Like say DCC, for instance, you have a patron that you subjugate yourself for power, right? So that's kind of gets more in the sword and sorcery idea that you have cults
Right.
with a particular deity or patron, but it does make it more like so that even like a magic user who you think might be secular and scientific really is groveling to some deity-like figure to get that too. But it's interesting. I wonder. I mean, I'm sure if we like looked historically, where did this stop? But definitely, I would say that there was a lot more patronage of your faith, at least up until the Age of Enlightenment, and maybe even beyond that. Maybe even up until Georgian, Victorian type period, where there's still a lot of this. What we today might call superstition was really faith and belief that if you were a good person and you say like in Ireland or in Europe, especially, give offerings to your saint, that good things would happen, right? And it'd be as a part of your life, your daily life, your daily calendar. And that's not just for, we talked about Christianity, but sure, there's festivals in the other big religions in this world as well, and I'm definitely, there are definitely people who do that, but I would say it's a much smaller population than maybe it used to be way back. But it's kind of neat. I mean, I guess you're right. Like as a GM, you're building a world or trying to get that into your world. I mean, I guess you try it and maybe you see if it annoys your players or not, and then how much are they? And you guys know you have the player that is going to game this system. He's going to have his handful of coins and go to every single deity, get all his luck points. But hey, man, maybe that's cool. Maybe that's what we want.
Yeah.
Oh, you get rival deities blessing you, and then
right.
Then you get in trouble. You get the evil eye.
Yeah.
You tried to game the system.
Try to game the system, right?
I think one thing that's
quest, right?
interesting with DCC is, even if you wanted to do away with the wizards having to have some kind of non-divine patron, which they kind of play to me some like warlocks and kind of contemporary D&D in that regard. But when a cleric's spells don't work, they kind of risk ticking off their deity, and they have to atone and make up for what they've done. They've insulted their deity. But when a wizard screws up, they get mutations. The implication is arcane magic is not something you're supposed to be tampering with, and you're putting all of us at risk by doing it. Versus if you're appealing to an actual god who kind of understands the way the universe works, that's the proper way to wield magical power, because then the god is put a restraint on you and can take that power away if you're not using it properly. Versus these demons and other entities that wizards deal with are just kind of winding them up and sending them out in the world to sow chaos.
Right. Yeah. The law of first casting. And that might take us a little bit out of that's an interesting thing. And I think that's a neat discussion. It might be a little out of what we're doing tonight, but the idea of magic, but I think that's a podcast on its own, right? The nature of magic and RPGs. So the idea of how scientific magic is, or whether it's coming from chaos and you're sowing the destruction of the world by the use of it. I think there's a great conversation to be had with that.
Yeah. The other thing is, I think, as I pointed out, I think before, maybe I don't think I have on my podcast. I know I've talked with friends is about clerics in terms of fantasy are a D&Dism. In most traditional fantasy, priests and wizards are the same thing, particularly in sword and sorcery. There are wizards, and some of them happen to serve gods and act as priests. There's not that distinction, but we have that distinction in D&D going back to the beginning.
It's a cult, like a cult type of thing, right? They're a leader of a cult, and they happen to be a spellcaster.
Yeah.
Well, you have that, and then you have your other things would be either a friar tuck or paladins. Your Arthurian and your things like that, that kind of thing. But for the most part, but there's no question the priest as exists in D&D came about because of D&D and because of those early games where well, we need to deal with this vampire. So who's going to fight? This player's playing a vampire. So who's going to Sir Fang and who's going to oppose him? And, and then it kind of morphed. And obviously the D&D priest is very much a Christian based thing when you look at it.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
just because what built, which is what the creators knew. And, they did it for their own game and it got their home campaign and it got ported into the game. But yeah, it's definitely interesting. Any thoughts, Joe, on I don't know that you might have already spoke, but I don't think you spoke on the idea of how having players play clerics or how you like to play them or.
Yeah, no, I was just listening. There's some really good ideas in there because I don't put in nearly enough festivals and things like that because I in my heart I want players to kind of initiate that stuff on their own. I don't want to force it on them because most of my players don't tend to play divine spellcasters other than in this game, Wrath of the Righteous, that I'm currently running. But for the most part, when I run homebrew stuff, my players typically don't play divine characters. So I have to work hard to get my gods in there because I love them so much.
Now, you bring up your current game, which I'm lucky enough to be in, and you have a couple paladins in there, and they're just, they're eating it up. They're doing a great job. They're, they're doing this without even prompting. They're, they're naming their gods and they're going at it and they're doing devotions to gods. We came across an area that was kind of tainted, and we spent a day just trying to cleanse this place. I mean, they're really into it. Your players. So you have players that are just buying right into it, which helps.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah,
it's awesome when they buy in.
Yeah, it definitely helps.
I think you just maybe need to give players prompts. I mean, I know we want to restrict to D&D, but this weekend when I I ran a medieval game, and in the medieval times, there's a lot more faith. But I put some little tidbits among the players to prompt them that maybe they were more, had more faith than others. And the players really hinge on that. So I think we just really need to, just as Joe has done with the Paladins, and you had a festival at the beginning of that adventure, I heard.
Right.
Right. You give them the prompts, and I think you give the players the tools, and I think they'll grab onto it. So I think you want to embrace that role-playing opportunity.
Yeah, I agree with that. So let's bring back to a particular D&Dism, and this does appear in other games as well. But a lot of us grew up, either with BX or with BECME. BECME being the Mentor basic, and then expert, companion, master, and immortal sets. Those box basic sets for D&D. And in the immortal set, you can ascend to godhood. Have any of you guys either run or played in a game where that kind of thing has happened, or any thoughts on that? The idea of PC. I know a lot of people, especially in the OSR sphere, are the idea, well, we like low-level campaigns. We never get over 5th level, stuff like that. But that's not everybody's campaign by any means. Any thoughts?
My only experience is I was starting out in junior high, and the DM's character from when he was a player with a different group was the god that was kind of we all had to worship.
That's brilliant.
But I think that's typical, when you're 13, 14 years old. That's I think a lot of the bizarre stuff we have it from the 80s in D&D is because it was mostly junior high and high school kids running. The DM was the oldest person in the group, but we were all teenagers, and so
everyone wanted the rod of lordly might.
Yeah.
War Pearl Sword. No, I did, and unless you have an anecdote, Joe, I can give one.
No, you go, dude. I'll go.
During the 3.5, we played a lot, and we did have characters ascend to level 20, and it was during all the Ed Greenwood novels about avatars and chosen. So one player said, "Well, I want to be a chosen too. My deity doesn't have a published chosen." So he worked really hard, and we did have this tale where someone ascended, maybe not to like a deity, but like angelic, right? So can avatar, a chosen of the deity. And then we just had it in the fiction of the world that there are now like a cult of this saint, that was a chosen. Nice. So then, if I run in the Forgotten Realms again, people could be a cleric or a part of the cult of this, this person. I think that's the closest I've had. But he really, this guy really, did the work. Even became an aesthetic. And when you get that high level, you get so much money, and you just like, I don't want it. Just
nice.
running, rolling through water deep or flying through water deep, just dropping coins.
I think the Finder Stone trilogy depicts mortal ascending to pre-Avatar, where they, in the Avatar trilogy, 3 of them.
Yeah.
But this was the kind of
maybe got inspiration.
He appears throughout three novels as kind of a powerful retired adventurer who by the end has figured out how to become a demigod.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome. In the Pathfinder world, it's baked in there. There's this thing called the Starstone, and one of their gods, this dude Caden Kaleen, just got super hammered and went there and passed the test. The test is super mysterious. Nobody knows what it actually happens. Came out and is basically like the god of partying now. So it's kind of like built into the system of Pathfinder that you could do that. There is a place in the Pathfinder world where you can go and you get teleported and you take this crazy mythical test, and if you pass, you become a god.
That's not the only. That's not unique, right? There's a couple other powers of it. But somewhere along they have the adventure somewhere. Paizo has that adventure, I'm sure, somewhere.
Yeah.
That they're gonna
well, D&D published them. Like I say, that was part of the Beckme set, and there were immortal adventures.
Yeah,
there are immortal adventures out there to play with that black box set. I've never played those adventures, but they're out there.
If I remember right, when you get to the immortal level, I've never played it. I've kind of thumbed through it. It takes on a very different. It says how does a DM help a player do this? It's like a very. You send them on these mythic quests, and they have to chain these really high challenges of their own accord before of course in Beckme, assuming you're playing them in Star, there aren't gods, they're just immortals who were all previously mortal, and they then one of them will sponsor you to kind of go on these quests, and then petition for you to join the Pantheon if you succeed. Because it's a very different sort of set of acquiring powers than just leveling up at that point.
Right. Yeah. So I'm not overly interested in doing that in a D&D world. I now we're mainly talking fantasy, or other games do this as well, right? So like Unknown Armies, that's kind of an aspect of that as you're trying to eventually get to that level. Hopefully, maybe. I mean, you can play on Unknown Armies different levels, but that might be like the end game for that too, to some degree. But is that something that interests you guys, either as a player or a GM, to run that level? Because it's kind of like if you're playing, and again, this isn't fantasy, but you're running Marvel or you're running a superhero game, there's a big difference between playing street level or even the Avengers compared to playing Cosmic, right? Playing the Silver Surfer and stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
Or playing Superman like Carl did. I mean, Superman really is a hugely different scale than Batman is when you think about it, right?
Unless Batman has prep time.
Right. Yeah, unless Batman has prep time. Yeah. But so I kind of derailed. I don't mean to derail us, but
no, that's
thoughts on running Cosmic games or these kind of games compared to the normal games we run.
I mean, I think it'd be fun, like as a one shot or a mini campaign. But I don't think you could, as a long term campaign. It doesn't seem tenable now. For us. I mean, and then if I'm going to play something godlike, hell, let's just play godlike with superheroes. I mean, I don't know. I guess you could do like fantasy superheroes. You could do 1602, but something like that.
Yeah. At some point, I'd probably just rather play a medieval themed superhero game and just crank it up to where we're all, Thor, Superman, Captain Marvel, Silver Surfer levels of power.
Yeah.
But that's what you do in Pathfinder, though, right, Joe? You got plus 50 or plus 80 to your attribute.
Well, you'll never get that high, but yeah, man. I mean, really, what's the difference at a certain point of like a super high level Pathfinder character and Superman? Very, very little at a certain point. And we were starting to head that way with my last campaign, my last homebrew campaign. And we'll definitely head that way with Wrath of the Righteous, because Wrath of the Righteous is the first adventure that Paizo put out that goes 1 to 20. So we're definitely going to see what it's like. So yeah, strap in, Jason. It's going to be a long ride.
And you guys, it does Mythic, right? The Mythic stuff is crazy. That's very super powered.
Oh, dude,
well, and actually, Joe's run a mini campaign doing this, right? You did. Yeah. What level were those characters you ran?
So the one where I gave out Mythic.
Yeah.
They were like 5th or 6th level, but I was giving them some Mythic.
The one you had them create characters for, that Jules and a couple other people did.
For the 20th level game.
Yeah, that's it. That's
yeah. I ran a 20th level game for a group of people, and it's insane. 20th level it's a whole different world of RPGs. It's super fun. It'd be crazy to run a whole campaign of it, though. But if you're building up over the series of a long campaign, that's sort of like kind of the end goal. You solve all the problems on the world, so then you go off into the cosmos and you're doing crazy stuff.
Yeah, because you guys were fighting like undead dragons and titans and all kinds of crazy stuff, right?
Well, it begs the question: how close is a 20th level character in power to a god?
Yeah,
is that the apex? Are you one step away from demigod or 20th level, or are gods so powerful that even a party of 20th level adventurers are like, we challenged a god and it took about half a second and we all just ceased to exist because he just willed us out of existence. Where's the scale of what when you actually become a god?
I think they changed that. I feel like in maybe 2nd edition, where you never really fought gods like they had statted out in deities and demigods. You just fought like their avatar, like an aspect of the god. And then that would be a challenge for a 20th level character. And just like I think the closest I got to that was that those 20th level guys with the same, like a Slod Lord, who's like CR 25, let's say, right? And they fought him at 19, 20 level. And so, so that's what you're fighting. You're fighting like maybe demigods, avatars, demon lords. But I like an actual god. You're right, because if you're a god, right? If you're omnipotent and omniscient, you just create an army of avatars of yourself through the multiverse.
Right.
Yeah. Well, it's like it's like that quote in the Cthulhu Now book that was out in the 90s. You know what happens when you hit Cthulhu with a nuclear weapon? He reforms 5 minutes later, and he's now radioactive. Right? It's
Yeah, and I kind of prefer that with kind of circling back to when you create gods is that I kind of like the idea that you're immortal. I don't.
Yeah.
I don't want I'm not a big fan of the grimdark, pathetic aesthetic. Sometimes I want to play that, but most of the times I do want to play a little more type of heroic fantasy. But I still want to kind of have this sense that these are mortal heroes striving to do something, and it's a struggle for them, not that these are predestined people that are on their path to becoming demigods, and that there's just a qualitative difference that and maybe the gods are former mortals, but it's not just I amassed as much power as earthly possible, and then said some magic words and touch the touchstone, and now I'm divine.
Well, in Greyhawk, right, the PD or the GDQ, the GDQ series, right, at the end you fight Loth. Right, that's sorry everyone, spoilers if you haven't heard of that.
I don't stat my gods out. They're on a whole nother level. Even if the players got to 20th level, my gods could still show up and be like, you're now 1st level again. Like the gods are the gods. They don't play they don't have classes and levels and stuff.
They have the cheat codes to the universe.
Yeah, exactly.
They don't have a CR, right? They don't have a CR.
Right. As it should be, really, right? So you guys run a lot of games. You've played in a lot of games. What are some examples of some favorite things you've seen in your games or games you played in with pantheons and gods?
I think my favorite thing. Well, no, this is more playing a cleric. It's not a specific god thing, but a couple of weeks ago we were playing Dungeon Crawl Classics, and I played a cleric, and I got in a spell duel with a hag, and we both rolled the highest, and just tore open a hole in reality. But that was a lot of fun.
That's awesome.
And then it left me with translucent skin.
For a millisecond, you had ascended to godhood.
Yeah.
You and the hag together forever.
Nice.
No. I'm trying to think of if I've got a favorite moment of a god showing up. I'll have to think about it a little more. Why don't you rest you guys go ahead, and if I think of something, I'll pipe in.
So I mentioned it at the beginning, but my favorite moment of a god popping up in one of my campaigns was when Maveth, my all-time favorite god that I've created, the goddess of death, guardian of the Grey Gate, wolf mother, raven queen. She fucking owns my heart. She wanted to talk to one of the PCs, and so she just showed up on the middle of this battlefield, just stabbed him through the chest with a greatsword, killed him because she's the goddess of death, and then just talked to him in the dead zone and then brought him back to life. And that was just because when I stabbed the character through the chest, the player was like, because I just murdered his character. So I rolled like a shit ton of dice too, right? I was like, you take like 89 damage. And he's like, oh my God. I was like, yeah, you're dead. And it was so much fun. It was awesome. That's mine. Also, just one note, sorry. In literature, my favorite Pantheon is the Malazan Book of the Fallen. It's the Pantheon of Genius. It's the best Pantheon in literature. Cool. All right. Okay, your turn, BJ.
I'm still thinking.
Carl, go ahead,
Carl. So it's me. So I think my favorite was back in AD&D. It was during that AD&D. And I think I sent in a message about this on someone's podcast. But hey, you guys, now everyone has it. Is during the Avatar War in the transition from AD&D 1 to 2 in the Forgotten Realms, and one of the players worshipped Miliki, the goddess of rangers in the forest, and the player characters the player character slept with Miliki.
Nice.
And this was in preparation for inspiration for the war against a Yenganu. I think it must have been on the Knoll God, and there was this big battle in the forest. And he got the other player characters to help him not sleep with his god, but to help him with the battle. but I think if we had continued that, I guess things fell apart shortly after there, or it never came to fruition. But I think I would have had like a little mini player character come out who was a demigod, of that union. I think that'd have been kind of cool. But that was kind of the funnest moment. We're crazy. This is like the times when we'd get together at my friend's dorm and order pizza and beer and play all night. That's what we do, That's kind of one of the cool things that happened with regards to gods. But I think my favorite Pantheon, I think real world Pantheon's got to be the Norse one. And now, especially since BJ's told me this more interesting stuff that I got to look up, with this guy, this cowboy archaeologist.
Oh yeah, Jackson Crawford. He's great. He's got a lot of it's lessons on Old Norse, but sometimes the ones where he starts talking about their mythology and their religion.
It's really fascinating. Cool. It's weird. We don't know about it, because we get Bullfinch's mythology in high school, right? Yeah. So, but we never really hear about the Norse gods as much. So I think it's just something interesting.
So in high school, we were playing I don't remember how much we were playing and how much we were just sort of making up stories about D&D characters. We were there was kind of a game and kind of a we would come back with our characters to the table that maybe were a little enhanced based on the BS stories we were telling in between sessions. But we encountered an avatar of Thor, and I can't remember what the deal was with Thor. Like we fought him, and then he was just kicked our ass because it's Thor. But was impressed with us, and so then later we got kind of in a bad way, and my character like fired an arrow at a demon or something, and it just spontaneously turned into a lightning bolt and blasted the demon, because that was sort of Thor's favor, kind of like, I'm sorry I dislocated your shoulder and your aim's a little off, here you go. Have a lightning bolt on me. So that was kind of cool. But most of my games kind of growing up, the gods didn't show up much. So it's been more as a DM trying to figure out how to make that a salient part of the world that the players' characters inhabit which can be kind of a challenge when I think I mean, circling back to maybe a previous point, how you play characters of faith, but I think I know if you don't have experience of participating in a religion, sometimes it can be kind of a hard, kind of a challenge to figure out how to play a character that has that kind of viewpoint.
So they got to show up and stab him in the chest.
Yeah. So like Carl was talking about earlier, about how religion was such a ubiquitous part of life for the Romans and for medieval Christians, and for a lot of people probably in the early days of our current culture. But as time goes by, we become more and more secular, and people don't have those reference points of how to play a person of faith who's deeply moved or deeply reverent or deeply concerned about whatever it is their deity is all about.
Yeah, unfortunately becomes a parody, like you shared with us a bit earlier.
Yeah, somebody's working out the axe they have to grind with religion, so they're playing a cleric, but they're playing them like a televangelist or a street preacher.
Right. I wonder how much, though. I think Carl brought something up interesting. This idea of how we used to play, where you did these all night sessions or all Saturday sessions, all day sessions, and now your typical sessions, 3 hours on the internet, right? Not saying everybody plays that way, but for a lot of people, games are 3 hours on the internet now. And I wonder how much that affects this as well. Just the idea that we want to maximize game time. So how much now, to their credit, like Joe's characters in his Wrath of the Righteous game, even though that game is pretty focused. So, even though Pathfinder's like crafting and all the stuff like that, he's doing a lot of stuff off the air between games, but just in what they're doing, the players are really good. So they're invoking their gods and doing the stuff just in what they're doing. I'm going to slap you in the name of my God kind of thing. They're just working into their dialogue. So they're doing it. But with some of this stuff, I wonder if it was easier to work in when we were playing 8-hour sessions compared to these sessions where we're trying to rush to get through, and especially if and that's a tough thing as a GM too, is just being able to let go and as a GM accept. We're going to stop at 11 o'clock tonight or whatever time tonight, and we're only going to get this far, and I can't push them to get, you can't have a predetermined stop point, realistically, because if you do, you're not going to get there because something's going to weigh it down or this or that.
Yeah, but that might be a discussion for a different show.
Right, but I guess what I'm getting at, though, is the idea that...
Jason, why don't you close this out by telling us about your favorite experience or Pantheon or something like that?
Yeah, I don't have one to share, but
you have to.
Which is why I rolled into that. But I do wonder though if not playing longer sessions affects this. I don't know. What you have any ideas on that, Carl?
I think the only way to test that out is to play a long session. I agree. I mean, I think I think sometimes you get a good group that really, it doesn't matter the game, but I think that's what you have to do is you have to get a group, and I think that's where it becomes like the onus is on the GM to really get the group invested in the game. So then they want to do all that extra stuff in between games, so then you can really get to the role playing and the less gamist. You let it flow, naturally, be less of a, rolling a bunch of dice and telling a story.
Definitely. Yeah. So we've had this discussion today. Is anybody think about changing the way they're addressing Pantheons and all going forward?
I like the idea that BJ and Carl were talking about of making them more fluid. I think that's cool. I'll probably start doing more of that stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it makes sense, right? Yeah, I mean, it depends on. It obviously depends on the Pantheon you built for your world, but we look at real world Pantheons. Not like Carl said. You're not just Norse, but your Greek. And even you go to in Asia and India and things like that. They weren't. I'm this god and this god only. You know,
it was like the whole thing.
Yeah.
I think I did this a little bit when I started Storm King's Thunder with my 5th edition group, was having, because we've got a warlock and 2 paladins, and I was having them have omens and visions in their dreams, coming from their patrons and their deities to kind of warn them as to what's going to happen if they don't do something. And I think I may need to incorporate that into some of my other games where I've got clerics and paladins and say, you know, you have this dream and it's giving you a clue as to where you might go next or what's about to happen that you want to be prepared for. But I also think just you mentioned the shorter sessions. I think players want to get experience points and level up and have more powerful characters. And whether that's going out for gold, depending on how you do XP, or going out to fight monsters and solve problems, they want to get to the action. And so, I think a lot of those, unless you're encountering like an evil cult or taking down a shrine, they are fighting undead or a demon or something. A lot of that could come in the downtime activity where you've got to make space for. And it's harder with these shorter sessions because you want to kind of, if we're playing 3 hours every other week, we want to give you your experience points because you know, otherwise you're going to be a first level character for the next 8 months.
Yeah.
But I think trying to incorporate in the downtime where I'm going with that is you know, people should be coming up to the clerics and the paladins and asking them religious questions. Oh, please, my leg hurts. Can you just, you know, can you give me a blessing? You know, can you say a prayer for my wife? She's sick. And, you know, my father just departed. Could you bless our house so that his spirit can depart and isn't hanging around haunting us? You know, and then that doesn't even have to be rolling dice. It's just that you can say, yeah, clerics can do that. Those are kind of routine.
That's a really good idea.
Take the sign of the cross.
So you give them,
go with God.
You give the players the tools by, you know, giving them prompts. I think that's what I'm going to do different, is to really, you know, do it kind of things that what BJ said, show around them that the world is invested in the worship of deities, and put things, you know, give them like omens, and you could do all these things. And I think what it all is, all of these are just different tools to give the players something to think about, and think about the faith that their characters have in the worlds that we create.
If the world expects them to act that way, they'll start acting that way.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
100%. If you're a cleric of essentially the same religion or alignment or whatever, going through a land, and you pass other travelers going through that land, they're probably going to ask your blessing as you pass them on the road, or you get into that small village. You know, you're going to have people coming up to you asking you that. You know. And it's incorporating that into the game.
The other thing that occurs to me too is something I think I heard Mike Merles mention one time, is that if you've got a god of the forge, his temple should be the place everybody goes to buy metal goods. If you've got a god who is the god of agriculture, well, they should oversee the harvests, and that they should provide public infrastructure. So say in Forgotten Realms, if you go to Waterdeep, well, where's the fighting pit? Well, it's actually over the temple of
Cord.
I can't remember the Forgotten Realms god of war. Not Tyr, he's more Justice. Tempest, yeah. They're because Tempest wants people to challenge themselves to become better warriors. Well, where's the place to get a good drink? Oh, go over to the god of beer.
Right.
That's the place to get.
And that's where
the tavern.
Well, that's where Pathfinder's God capitalism comes in, right? The God of bankers or whatever.
Yeah.
They have. I assume those they actually run banks and all too. Right?
They do. The banks in Galarian are all run by the Church of Abadar.
You've been accused of a crime. You've got to go to the temple to the God of justice, because the judge in this town is going to be a priest of that god.
Yeah.
And definitely, I think the designers of these games think about these things and have that, right? Like even in our Abomination Vaults, like one of the taverns is a temple to Caden Kalin,
right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. The designers definitely think that. I think and the library is, for the trio of deities that's important to them. So the designers give us the tools. We just got to communicate these tools to our players.
Right.
I think they'll embrace them. I mean, I've even seen like I said this weekend in small anecdotes, that if you give little tidbits to players, they'll take them and run with them, because they want to tell the story too. They want to be able to take a little sentence you give them as part of their background, or as a dream from their god, and they'll make it a whole freaking campaign. It's a whole motivation for a campaign.
Definitely. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining this panel and discussing this. Thank you so much. There'll be links to all your podcasts in the show notes. I'll have links to the podcast that BJ was talking about. We'll have a link to that in the show notes. I'll put a link to James Holloway's Pantheon, pamphlet of Pantheons. Anyway, there'll be all the things we talked about. There'll be links to all the things in the show notes. So, and we'll see you guys again. Well, a panel. It might be us. It might be different people.
You never know.
Yeah, you never know. We'll talk again in about 2 weeks. So
yeah, well, thanks for having us, Jason.
Thank you, Jason, for running it.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah, it's good to see everybody.
Yep.
Okay, take care, folks.
Peace.
A Nerd Central broadcast, Cerebral podcast. Let's savor all the flavors from the spinal tap straw. All styles and podcasts, Cerebral podcast. You're counting down your last as you admire them all. Something's plenty, oh, so in your brain, baby. What I mean is the sessions are fake, and from what I understand, don't look now, the Super Bowl is coming, and all that's left is the crying and the running. You can pick me, you can pile, you can bomb in any order. Just another ring of real tossers running for the point. Just a snack like a one. Can I stutter? Beer and beer. Respected buzz, you can eat on a bacon, and his customers never say it. Wasn't saving the flavor of the music created.